This is AP Psychology, Chapter 2, Neuroscience and Behavior. Our nervous system plays a vital role in how we think, feel, and act. Neurons and basic building blocks of the body circuitry receive signals through their branching dendrites and cell bodies and transmit electrical impulses down their axons. Chemical messengers called neurotransmitters traverse the tiny synaptic gap between neurons and pass on excitatory or inhibitory messages. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of the somatic nervous system, which directs voluntary movements and reflexes, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls the glands and muscles of our internal organs. Hormones released by the endocrine glands affect our tissues, including the brain. The most influential endocrine gland, the Pituitary Gland, releases hormones that influence growth, and its secretions also influence the release of hormones by other glands. The nervous system directs the endocrine secretions, which then affect the nervous system. Evolution has elaborated new brain systems on top of old. Within the brainstem are the oldest regions, the medulla and the reticular formation. The thalamus sits atop the brainstem, and the cerebellum extends from the rear. The limbic system includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. The cerebral cortex, representing the highest level of brain development, is responsible for our most complex functions. Each hemisphere of the cerebral cortex has 4 geographical areas: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Although small, well-defined regions within these lobes control muscle movement and receive information from body senses. Most of the cortex is association areas. They are free to process information. Experiments on split brain patients suggest that for the most people, the left hemisphere is the more verbal and the right hemisphere excels in visual perception and recognition of emotions. Studies of people with intact brains indicate each hemisphere makes unique contributions to the integrated functions of the brain. Everything psychological is simultaneously biological. We think, we feel, we act with our bodies. By studying the links between biology and psychology, biological psychologists are gaining new clues to sleep and dreams, depression and schizophrenia, hunger, sex, stress, and disease. In the 1800s, Franz Gall invented phrenology, a popular theory that claimed that the bumps on the skull reveal our mental abilities and our character traits. Although bumps on the skull reveal nothing about the brain underlying function, Gall was accurate in supposing that various regions have particular functions. Ancient conceptions of the mind. Plato correctly placed mind in the brain. However, his student Aristotle believed that the mind was in the heart. Today we believe the mind and brain are faces of the same coin. Everything that is psychological is simultaneously biological. In 1800, Franz Gall suggested that the bumps of the skull represented mental abilities. This theory, though incorrect, nevertheless proposed that different mental abilities were modular. The idea that specific mental processes are located in or associated with discrete parts of the brain can be traced back to the early 1800s, when German physician Franz Gall invented phrenology. Its most important assumption was that bumps of the skull could reveal our mental abilities and character traits. Gall was the first great comparative anatomist of brains. His careful examination of brains was of many different species led him to the conclusion that higher mental functions correlated with the size of the brain. While the correlation is imperfect, He did demonstrate the tendency for animals with larger brains to manifest more complex, flexible, and intelligent behavior. It was this demonstration, more than any other argument, that convinced scientists that the brain was in the center of all higher mental activity. Unfortunately, because Gall embedded his contribution in the ill-fated theory of phrenology, he is now viewed as somewhat of a quack. Gall's theory appears to have had its origin in an early childhood experience. In his autobiography, he relates how a boy he was exasperated by fellow students who, while less intelligent than themselves, received higher grades because they were better memorizers. In reflecting on his rival, he concluded that they all had one prominent physical characteristic in common: large, protruding eyeballs. Convinced that the greater intelligence was associated with larger brains, he speculated the specific parts of the brain were the seats of specific faculties of traits. People with good verbal memories might have particularly well-developed organs of verbal memory somewhere in their brains. Gall further summarized that this was in the region of the frontal lobes directly behind the eyes, where the pressure of the enlarged brain caused the eyes to protrude. By observing people who exhibited particular characteristics, Gall pinpointed areas of the brain responsible for 37 different traits, including musical talent, cautiousness, faithfulness, benevolence, and hope. For example, when he asked a group of lower-class boys that he had befriended to run errands for him, he found that their attitudes toward petty theft varied greatly. Measuring the boys' heads, he reported that the inveterate thieves had bumps just above and in front of their ears. He hypothesized an organ of acquisitiveness in the brain beneath. Observation of people with strong sexual drives convinced Gall that they had developed neck and skull bases. This led him to localize personality characteristic of amativeness in the cerebellum. At the height of his popularity, phrenology was a parlor game played by the well-to-do in Europe. It found particularly fertile soil in the United States, where celebrities such as Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman were among its adherents. Manuals for self-diagnosis were published. Phrenologists even counseled employers on screening job applicants. In 1852, Horace Greeley suggested that railroad workers be selected by the shape of their head. Phrenology proved influential until well into the 20th century. Fancher suggests that among the obvious weaknesses of Gall's theory were: 1. His assumption that the shape of the skull accurately reflected the shape of the brain; 2. This totally inadequate classification of psychological characteristics that immediately doomed any attempt to localize these in the brain; and 3. His selective and arbitrary methods of observation. With 36 interacting traits to work with, it became easy to rationalize any apparent discrepancies in theory, presented with huge organ of acquisitiveness in a generous person. Gall could argue that a larger organ of benevolence counteracted the acquisitiveness tendencies, or certain organs might temporarily be impaired by disease. In short, the theory could be falsified. Some of Gall's students dramatically demonstrated this pitfall. When cast of Napoleon's right skull predicted qualities at variance with his known personality, one phrenologist replied that his left side had been dominant, but the cast of it was conveniently missing. When Descartes' skull was found deficient in the regions for reason and reflection, phrenologists argued that the philosopher's rationality had always been overrated. Although it's easy to find Gall's notions ridiculous, as Brian Kolb notes, we are well reminded of how we use physical appearance to judge personality traits. For example, the current research literature points to the presence of a strong physical attractiveness stereotype in which we judge what is beautiful as good. Neural communication is the body's information system is built from billions of interconnected cells called neurons. We are composed of a biological, psychological, and social cultural systems that interact. Psychologists study how these systems work together to shape our behavior. At all levels, researchers examine how we take information, organize, interpret, and store it, and use it. The information systems of humans and other animals operate similarly. For example, although the human brain is more complex than a rat's, both follow the same principles. This similarity permits researchers to study relatively simple animals to discover how neural systems operate. Neurobiologists and other investigators understand that humans and animals operate similarly when processing information. Note that the similarities in the above brain regions, which are all engaged in information processing. A nerve cell or a neuron consists of many different parts. The cell body, the cell's life and support center. Dendrites, they receive messages from other cells. The axon passes messages from the cell body to other neurons, muscles, or glands. The myelin sheath covers the axon of some neurons and helps speed the neural impulses. The neural impulse is the electrical signal traveling down the axon. Terminal branches of the axon form junctions with other cells and continue the message. A neuron consists of a cell body and branching fibers. The dendrite fibers receive information from sensory receptors or other neurons, and axon fibers pass the information along to other neurons. A layer of fatty tissue called the myelin sheath insulates the axons of some neurons and helps speed their impulses. A neural impulse fires when the neuron is stimulated by pressure, heat, light, or chemical messages from adjacent neurons. The received signal triggers an impulse only if the excitatory signals minus the inhibitory signals exceed the minimum intensity called the threshold. The neuron's reaction is an all or none response. The impulse, called the action potential, is a brief electrical charge that travels down the axon rather like manhole covers flipping open. During the resting potential, the fluid interior of the axon carries most negatively charged ions, while fluid outside has mostly positively charged ions. Then the first bit of the axon is depolarized. Its selectively permeable surface allows positive ions in, and the electrical impulses travel down the axon as channels open, emitting ions with a positive charge. When the charge channels close, others open and positive ions are pumped back out, restoring the neuron to its polarized state. So the parts of the neuron, once again, are the cell body, the life support center of the neuron, dendrites, branching extensions at the cell body. They receive the messages from other neurons. The axon, a long single extension of the neuron covered with the myelin sheath to insulate this and speed up messages through the neurons. And then terminal branches of axon, branched endings of an axon that transmit messages to other neurons. A neural impulse, a brief electrical charge, travels down an axon and is generated by movement of positively charged atoms in and out of the channels in the axon's membrane. Depolarization occurs when positive ions enter the neuron, making it more prone to firing an action potential. Hyperpolarization occurs when the negative ions enter the neuron, making it less prone to firing an action potential. Threshold. Each neuron receives a depolarizing, hyperpolarizing currents from many neurons. When depolarizing current, the positive ions, minus the hyperpolarizing current, the negative ions, exceed minimum intensity threshold, the minimum intensity known as threshold, the neuron fires the action potential. The refractory period. After a neuron fires an action potential, it pauses for a short period to recharge itself to fire again. The sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pumps pump positive ions out from the inside of the neuron, making them ready for another action potential. The all or none response: when the depolarizing current exceeds the threshold, a neuron will fire. If a depolarizing current fails to exceed the threshold, a neuron will not fire. Intensity of an action potential remains the same throughout the length of the axon. The synapse is the junction between the axon tip of the sending neuron and the dendrite cell body of the receiving neuron. This tiny gap is called the synaptic gap or cleft. Neurotransmitters are released from the sending neuron, travel across the synapse, and bind to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron, thereby influencing it to generate an action potential. Neurotransmitters in the synapse are reabsorbed into the sending neurons through the process of reuptake. This process applies the brakes on the neurotransmitter. When electrical impulses reach the axon terminal, they stimulate the release of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters that cross the junction between neurons called the synapse. After these molecules traverse the tiny synaptic gap between neurons, they combine with the receptor sites on neighboring neurons, thus passing on their excitatory or inhibitory messages. The sending neuron, in the process called reuptake, normally absorbs the excess of the neurotransmitter molecules in the synaptic gap. The serotonin pathways are involved with mood regulation. Dopamine pathways are involved with diseases such as schizophrenia, Parkinson's disease. Acetylcholine, its function is to enable muscle action, learning, and memory. Examples of their malfunctions would be Alzheimer's disease. Acetylcholine producing neurons deteriorate. Dopamine influences the movement and learning, attention, and emotion. Excess dopamine receptor activity is linked to schizophrenia. Starved of dopamine, the brain produces tremors and decreased mobility of Parkinson's disease. Serotonin affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. Undersupply linked to depression. Prozac and some other antidepressant drugs can raise serotonin levels. Norepinephrine helps to control alertness and arousal. Undersupply can depress your mood. GABA, known as GABA-aminobutyric acid, is a major inhibitory neuron transmitter. Undersupply linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. Glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter involved in memory. Oversupply can overstimulate the brain, producing migraines or seizures, which is why some people avoid MSG or monosodium glutamate in their food. Different neurotransmitters have different effects on behavior and emotion. For example, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine plays a crucial role in learning and memory. Found at every junction between motor neuron and skeletal muscle. Acetylcholine causes the muscle to contract. The brain's endorphins, natural opiates released in response to pain and vigorous exercise, explain the runner's high and an indifference to pain in some injured people. Neurotransmitters bind to the receptors of the receiving neuron in a key lock mechanism. The word endorphin was coined from endogenous morphine and refers to the brain's natural painkillers, opiates. After Cadice, Pert, and Solomon Snyder identified opiate receptors in the brain areas linked with pain, the race to identifying the brain's natural painkillers was on. The discovery of endorphins grew out of the curiosity of two British pharmacologists, Han Krolitz and John Hughes, who in 1975 isolated a substance from the brains of pigs that had the same actions as morphine. They named it enkephalon. Subsequently, other brain opiates were discovered. The group as a whole was named endorphins. The research has now indicated that these natural opiates are produced by the brain, the pituitary gland, and other tissues in response to pain, stress, and even vigorous exercise. While pain is necessary to warn us of danger to our physical well-being, constant intense pain would eventually incapacitate us, and so endorphins help our bodies to control the degree of pain. The studies of laboratory rats have demonstrated that not only shock, but even its anticipatory pain, studies of intense pain would eventually incapacitate us, and so endorphins help our bodies to control the degree of pain. Studies of laboratory rats have demonstrated that not only shock, but even its anticipation can produce an increase in brain endorphins. For example, when rats were placed in a chamber where they had been shocked a week earlier, the level of brain's natural opiates immediately increased. Other investigators have shown that psychological stress also triggers the production of endorphins. In one study, pain was induced by shock to the subject's foot. The degree of pain was not determined by measuring the reflex action of the leg muscles, a test that has proved reliable in other studies. The experimenters instead induced stress by sounding a warning signal 2 minutes before the shock might or might not be delivered. The subjects were tested under 3 conditions. Some were given an injection of a painkiller, such as morphine. A second group was given an injection of naloxone, a drug that suppresses endorphin activity in the brain. And the third group was given nothing at all. The initial pain sensitivity was identical in all 3 conditions. Results showed that with repeated stress, pain sensitivity decreased in both the injection pain decrease in injection group and indeed produced natural opiates. This suggested that the subjects of the non-injection group had indeed produced natural opiates. Proof of this came from the fact that men and women who received the endorphin suppressor actually showed more sensitivity to pain and stress as testing proceeded. As noted in the text, strenuous exercise also triggers the release of endorphins. Studies of seasoned runners, for example, showed during a long, difficult workout, the nervous system can dip into its endorphin reserve and not only block pain messages, but also produce so-called runner's high. Perhaps the greatest interest will be some applications of this research. The endorphin system can be brought into action by neurostimulation therapy. In this pain-reducing technique, wires are pasted to the skin near an injury, and slight electric current is delivered through electrodes. Low-frequency, high-intensity impulses stimulate endorphin release. Olympic athletes have used this method to ease various aches and pains. Steve Maslick reportedly played much of his final year of high school basketball with a battery-powered neurotransmitter under his uniform. He later played for the University of Pittsburgh. The device helped the 6'8" inch center participate despite stress fracture in his backbone. In 2009, Donovan McNabb, a quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles, threw 4 touchdown passes while playing with a broken ankle. This is the agonist molecule. It excites. It's similar enough in structure to the neurotransmitter molecule that it mimics its effects on the receiving neuron. It is similar enough. Morphine, for instance, mimics the action of the endorphins by stimulating receptors in the brain involved in mood and pain sensations. This antagonist molecule inhibits. It has a structure similar enough to the neurotransmitter to occupy its receptor site and block its action, but it's not similar enough to stimulate the receptor. Chiari poisoning paralyzes its victims by blocking acetylcholine receptors involved in muscle movement. When the brain is flooded with opiate drugs such as heroin and morphine, it may stop producing its own natural opiates. and withdrawal of these drugs may result in discomfort until the brain resumes production of its natural opiates. Some drugs, known as agonists, such as some of the opiates, mimic the natural transmitters and affect or block its reuptake. Others, antagonists, such as botulin, inhibit a particular neurotransmitter's release or block its effect. Researchers have used information about brain neurotransmitters in their efforts to create therapeutic drugs, such as those used to alleviate depression and schizophrenia. The problem is that the blood-brain barrier enables the brain to fence out unwanted chemicals. Neurons communicating with other neurons form our body's primary system, the nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord form the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system links the central nervous system with the body's sense. The nervous system consists of all three nerve cells. It is the body's speedy electrochemical communication system, the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, the sensory and motor neurons that connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. The axon carrying the peripheral nervous systems are bundled into electrical cables known as nerves. Sensory neurons send information from the body's tissue and sensory organs inward to the brain and the spinal cord, which processes the information. Motor neurons carry outgoing information from the central nervous system to the body's tissues. Interneurons in the motor outputs. Lou Gehrig, the pride of the New York Yankees, played baseball from 1923 until 1939. He's a member of the many World Series championship teams and set numerous individual records, including playing 2,130 consecutive games, a record that held until Cal Ripken Jr. played 2,131 consecutive games in 1990. In 1938, Gehrig started to lose strength. As Detroit Tiger pitcher Eldon Auker described it, Lou seemed to be losing his power. His walking and his running appeared to slow. His swing was not as strong as it had been in past years. Gehrig was suffering from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, known as ALS for short, which was first described by Jean-Martin Charcot in 1869. The disease has come to be known as Lou Gehrig's disease after he developed it. Lou died in 1941 at the age of 38. ALS strikes about 6 in every 100,000 people, usually between the ages of 60 and 75. Death is usually within 5 years of diagnosis. It begins with general weakness, first in the throat or upper chest, and then progressing to the arms and legs. Walking becomes difficult, and victims typically struggle with swallowing and speaking. The disease generally does not affect any of the sensory systems, cognitive functions, bowel or bladder control, or even sexual function. ALS is caused by death of motor neurons that connect the rest of the nervous system to the muscles enabling movement. Neurons in the brain that connect primary with motor neurons can also be affected. Amyotrophic means muscle weakness, and lateral sclerosis refers to the hardening of the lateral spinal cord, where motor neurons are located. Motor neurons may suddenly die because of the death of the microtubules that carry the proteins down the motor neuron axons, because of a buildup of toxic chemicals within the motor neurons, or as a result of toxic chemicals released from other neurons. Presently, there is no cure for ALS. Sensory neurons carry incoming information from the sense receptors to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carry outgoing information from the central nervous system to the muscle glands. Interneurons connect the two neurons. Astrocytes provide nutrition to the neurons. Oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells insulate neurons as myelin. The somatic nervous system, the division of the peripheral nervous system that controls the body's skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system that controls the glands and other muscles. The nerves consist of neural cables containing many axons. They are part of the peripheral nervous system and connect muscles, glands, and the sense organs to the central nervous system. The somatic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system enables voluntary control of our skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system is a dual self-regulating system that influences glands, muscles, and internal organs. The sympathetic nervous system arouses the parasympathetic nervous system and calms it. So the sympathetic nervous system is the division of the autonomic nervous system that arouses the body, mobilizing its energy in stressful situations, igniting our fight or flight response system. The parasympathetic nervous system division of the autonomic nervous system calms the body back down after our fight or flight and allows us to conserve energy. The sympathetic nervous system arouses that fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system calms and rest of the parasympathetic nervous system. The central nervous system, the spinal cord, and reflexes. In this simple hand withdrawal reflex, information is carried from skin receptors along the sensory neuron and the spinal cord. From here, it is passed to the interneurons, to the motor neurons that lead to muscles in the hand and the arm, the blue arrows. Because this reflex involves only the spinal cord, the hand jerks away from the candle flame even before the information about the event has reached the brain, causing experience of pain. The brain and the neural networks are interconnected neurons form networks in the brain. These networks are complex and modify with growth and experience. The endocrine system is the body's slow chemical communication system, is carried out by hormones synthesized by a set of glands. Reflexes, simple automatic responses to stimuli, illustrate the spinal cord's work. A simple reflex pathway is composed of a single sensory neuron and a single motor neuron, which often communicate through interneurons. For example, when our finger touches the candle's flame, from the skin receptor travels inward via sensory neuron to a spinal cord interneuron, which sends the signal outward to the arm muscle via a motor neuron. Because this reflex only involves the spinal cord, we jerk our hand away from the brain and creates the experience of pain. Before the brain creates an experience of pain. Neurons in the brain cluster into work groups called neural networks. These cells, each layer of neural network, connect with various cells in the next layer. With experience, networks can learn as feedback strengthens or inhibits connections that produce certain results. One network is interconnected with other networks which are distinguished by their specific functions. Hormones are chemicals synthesized by the endocrine glands that are secreted in the bloodstream. Hormones affect the brain and many other tissues of the body. For example, epinephrine or adrenaline increases heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar, and feelings of excitement during an emergency. The endocrine system's glands secrete hormones, chemical messengers produced in one tissue that travel through the bloodstream and affect other tissues, including the brain. Compared to the speed at which messages move through the nervous system, endocrine messages move more slowly, but their effects are usually longer lasting. The endocrine system's hormones influence many aspects of our lives, including growth, reproduction, metabolism, and mood. Keeping everything in balance while responding to stress exertion, and internal thoughts. In a moment of danger, the adrenal glands release hormones in epinephrine and norepinephrine, which increase heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar, and providing us with increased energy. The pituitary gland is the endocrine system's most influential gland. Under the influence of the brain's hypothalamus, the pituitary secretions influence growth and release hormones by other endocrine glands. These may in turn influence both the brain and behavior and thus reveal the intimate connection of nervous and endocrine systems. The pituitary gland is called the master gland. The anterior pituitary lobe releases hormones that regulate other glands. The posterior lobe regulates water and salt balance. The thyroid gland affects metabolism, among other things, and the parathyroids help regulate the level of calcium. Adrenal glands consist of the medulla and the cortex. The medulla secretes hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine during stressful and emotional situations, while the adrenal cortex regulates salt, carbohydrate, and metabolism. Adrenal glands are the inner part, called the medulla, helps trigger the fight or flight response. The pancreas regulates the level of sugar in the blood. Sex glands are located in different places in men and women. They regulate bodily development and maintain reproductive organs in adults. The testes secrete the male sex hormones, and the ovaries secrete the female sex hormones. Exocrine glands secrete substances outside the body. Examples include salivary glands and sweat glands. Endocrine means within the endocrine glands, and secrete from within the body into the bloodstream. The hormone receptor molecule is the key to understanding the operation of the endocrine system. That is, hormone actions are typically very specific because only certain cells in the body can respond, and often only at limited times. For example, oxytocin is released by a posterior pituitary and carried through the bloodstream to all the tissues and cells in the body, yet it acts only on two tissues, the breasts and the uterus, in the female. Furthermore, it acts only under certain conditions. It causes breast tissue to eject milk only if the female has recently given birth and is nursing. Oxytocin also causes uterine contractions at the end of pregnancy. Richard Thompson provides a specific example and clear example of how the endocrine system works, which under stressful conditions, the hypothalamus produces a hormone called cortisotrophin releasing hormone. The CRH that travels to the cells in the anterior pituitary, causing it to release androcorticotropic hormone, ACTH, into the bloodstream. ACTH acts on the adrenal gland, causing its cells to release cortisol, a stress hormone that mobilizes the body. The increased blood level of cortisol eventually acts back on the hypothalamus and pituitary to decrease their release of CRH and ACTH. This general sequence is true of all endocrine gland action. It is comparable to the thermostat's regulation of temperature. As hormone level goes up, thermostats in the hypothalamus and the pituitary are turned off. As it goes down, they are turned on. A brain lesion experimentally destroys brain tissue to study animal behaviors after such destruction. Clinical observations have shed light on the number of brain disorders. Alterations in brain morphology due to neurological and psychiatric diseases are now being cataloged. The oldest method of studying the brain involved observing the effects of the brain diseases and injuries. But now the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging scans, now reveal brain structures in electrocephalograms, EEGs. PETs, positron emission tomography, and the fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, recordings reveal activities in the living brain. By surgically lesioning and electrically stimulating specific brain areas, by recording electrical activity on the brain's surface, and by displaying activity with computer-aided brain scans, neuroscientists can examine the connections between brain and mind and behavior. The new brain imaging techniques are doing for psychological science what the microscope did for biology and the telescope for astronomy. Every year, scientists announce new discoveries and also generate new interpretations of old discoveries. Scientists have long been able to map basic functions such as memory, language, and musical ability. Now some brain mappers are wondering if neuroimaging techniques can also unravel the more complex mysteries of consciousness, morality, and empathy. For example, one study, researchers imaged the brains of participants as they reflected on a variety of moral dilemmas. Using earlier data about the emotions are processed, the researchers found that even when people think they are making strictly rational judgments, they also seem to be employing emotion, because both emotion and reasoning areas are highlighted. Marcus Rachel, a professor of radiology and neurology at Washington University in St. Louis, is trying to learn something of the sense of self. How might the brain generate the sense that you're you and I'm me, and we know that? He hypothesizes that some brain's frenetic resting activity, it consumes about 20% of the body's entire energy budget, even when not engaged in a particular task, might be supporting self-awareness. In scans of people undertaking challenges that seem to lie outside the self, such as math problems, baseline resting activity dropped off. In portion of the brain's prefrontal cortex, a couple of inches beyond the center of the forehead, Rachel's team then compared brain activity in situations that were identical except in the self-involvement they required. In one case, the participants had to say whether pictures of mundane objects, say picnic scenes or kittens, belong indoors or outdoors. This task, which demanded the participants step outside themselves, caused activity in the prefrontal areas to decrease. In other cases, they were asked to consider whether the same pictures had pleasant or unpleasant associations. As the viewers considered their own responses to the pictures, activity in the possible self-network surged. The research team concluded that at least part of our sense of self depends on knots of neurons elaborately interconnected in the prefrontal cortex. Other researchers are looking for the basics of other, that is, our ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes and imagine their beliefs and desires. Charles Firth and his colleagues at the University College in London asked participants to think about the following events. A burglar robs a shop, walks down the street, unknowingly drops his glove. A policeman coming from behind stops him to tell him about the glove. The burglar turns around and surrenders. Why does he do this? The answer requires thinking about other. The burglar thinks the policeman is about to arrest him. The neural circuits in the participants' brains that light up at this moment of empathy paralleled the ones that typically light up when they're thinking about oneself. Thinking about researchers are quick to acknowledge the limits of their methodology. For example, Dartmouth's Michael Gazzaniga notes that the fMRI traces brain activity by tracking blood flow, which rises whenever there is a surge in metabolism. Elements of some tests, he suggests, may be so automatic that they require no increase in metabolism, thus allowing the active brain regions to slip past the technique undetected. Eric Kandel of Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons adds, if a number of areas show activation, we don't know whether they are casually involved or going along for the ride. Certainly, no one claims that research will identify a single brain area as the site of morality or consciousness. Everything that happens in the brain is based on the work of systems like music in an orchestra performed from a score, says Antonio Damasio of the University of Iowa. It sounds like one thing, but it is coming from 100 or more individual parts. What we're doing is finding out those little parts. So an electroencephalogram, an EEG, is an amplified recording of electrical waves sweeping across the brain surface, measured by electrodes placed on the scalp. The PET, or the positron emission tomography scan, is a visual display of brain activity that detects radioactive form of glucose while the brain performs a given task. The MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, uses magnetic fields as radio waves to produce computer-generated images that distinguish among different types of brain tissue. The top images show ventricular enlargement in the schizophrenic patient. The bottom image shows brain regions when the participant lies. The brainstem is the oldest part of the brain, and beginning where the spinal cord swells and enters the skull. It's responsible for automatic survival functions. The medulla is the base of the brainstem that controls heartbeat and breathing. The reticular formation is a nerve network in the brainstem that plays an important role in controlling arousal. The thalamus is the brain's sensory switchboard located at the top of the brainstem. It directs messages to the sensory areas in the cortex and transmit replies to the cerebellum and the medulla. The cerebellum is often called the little brain. It's attached to the rear of the brainstem. It helps coordinate voluntary movements and balance. The limbic system. The limbic system is the donut-shaped system of neural structures at the border of the brainstem and the cerebrum, associated with emotions such as fear, aggression, and drives for food and sex. It includes the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. The amygdala consists of two almond-shaped neural clusters linked to the emotions of fear and anger. The hypothalamus lies below the hypothalamus. Hypo means below. The hypothalamus lies below the thalamus. It directs several maintenance activities like eating, drinking, body temperature, control of emotions. It helps govern the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. The brainstem is the brain's oldest and innermost region and is responsible for our automatic survival function. It includes the medulla, which controls heartbeat and breathing, and the reticular formation, which plays an important role in controlling arousal. Atop of the brainstem is the thalamus, the brain's sensory switchboard. It receives information from all the senses except smell and sends it to the higher brain regions that deal with seeing, hearing, and tasting and touching. The cerebellum, attached to the rear of the brainstem, coordinates movement, output, and balance and helps process sensory information. It also enables one type of nonverbal learning and memory and helps us judge time, modulate our emotions, and discriminate sounds and texture. The limbic system has been linked primarily to memory, emotions, and drives. For example, one of its neural centers, the hippocampus, helps process memories. Another, the amygdala, influences aggression and fear. And the third, the hypothalamus, has been linked to various bodily maintenance functions and to pleasure and pleasurable rewards. Its hormones influence the pituitary gland, and it provides a major influence between the nervous and endocrine systems. So the reward center, rats cross an electrified grid for self-stimulation. When the electrodes are placed in the reward center of the hypothalamus, when the limbic system is manipulated, a rat will navigate fields or climb up tree bottom. The cerebral cortex is the intricate fabric of the interconnected neural cells that covers the cerebral hemisphere. It is the body's ultimate control and information processing. The cerebral cortex is a thin sheet of cells composed of billions of nerve cells. and their countless interconnections. It is the body's ultimate control and information processing center. Glial cells support, nourish, and protect nerve cells of the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobes just behind the forehead are involved in speaking, muscle movement, and planning and making judgments. The parietal lobes at the top of the head and toward the rear receive sensory input for touch, body position. The occipital lobes at the back of the head include visual areas. The temporal lobes just above the ears include auditory areas. Each lobe performs many functions and interacts with other areas of the cortex. So each brain hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes that are separated by prominent fissures. These lobes are the frontal lobe, which is basically the forehead area, the parietal lobe, which is the top and rear to the rear of the head. The occipital lobe would be the back of the head. The temporal lobe is the 2 sides of the head. The motor cortex is an area in the of the frontal lobes that control voluntary movements. The sensory cortex, or the parietal cortex, receives information from the surfaces of the skin and the sense organs. And as you can see from this diagram, they've identified various parts of the body that can be stimulated by touching these particular areas of the parietal lobe. The functional MRI scan shows the visual cortex is active as the subject looks at faces, so it's showing activity. The functional MRI scan shows the auditory cortex is active in the patients who hallucinate. So here, as you can see, that these MRI scans will indicate to us these association areas. More intelligent animals have increased uncommitted or association areas of the cortex. The motor cortex, an arch-shaped region of the rear of the frontal lobes, controls the voluntary muscle movements on the opposite side of the body. Body parts requiring the most precise control occupy the greatest amount of cortical space. In an effort to find the source of motor control, researchers have recorded messages from brain areas involved in planning and intention, leading to the testing of neural prosthetics to paralyzed patients. The sensory cortex, a region of the frontal and parietal lobes, registers and processes body sensations. The most sensitive body parts require the largest amount of space in the sensory cortex. The association areas are not involved in the primary motor or sensory functions. Rather, they interpret and integrate and act on information processed by the sensory areas. They are involved in higher mental functions such as learning, remembering, thinking, speaking. Association areas are found in all 4 lobes. Complex human abilities such as memory, language, all result from intricate coordination of the many brain areas. Aphasia is an impairment of language usually caused by the left hemisphere damage, either to Broca's area, impaired speaking, or Wernicke's area, impaired understanding. So here we see some of the different association areas in this diagram. The visual cortex receives written words as visual stimulation. The angular gyrus transforms visual representations into auditory code. Wernicke's area interprets auditory code. Broca's area controls speech and muscles via motor coordination, and the motor cortex, of course, allows for the words to be pronounced. Language depends on a chain of events of several brain regions. When we read the sentence aloud, the words register in the visual area. Two, they are relayed to the angular gyrus, which transforms the words into auditory code, which is 3, received and understood in the nearby Wernicke's area. 4, sent to Broca's area, which 5 controls the motor cortex as it creates a pronounced word. Depending on which link in the chain is damaged, a different form of aphasia occurs. For example, damage to the angular gyrus leaves the person able to speak and understand but unable to read. Damage to Wernicke's area disrupts understanding, and damage to Broca's area disrupts speaking. Brain activity when hearing, seeing, and speaking words. As you can see, the different parts of the brain light up during each of these different activities. The brain's plasticity is sculpted by our genes, but also by our experiences. Plasticity refers to the brain's ability to modify itself after some type of injury or illness. Our brain is divided into 2 hemispheres. The left hemisphere processes reading, writing, speaking, mathematics, and comprehension skills. In the 1960s, it was termed as the dominant brain. Research indicates that some neural tissue can reorganize in response to an injury and damage. When one brain area is damaged, others may in time take over some of its function. For example, if you lose a finger, the sensory cortex that received its input will begin to receive input from the adjacent fingers, which become more sensitive. New evidence reveals that adult humans can also generate new brain cells. Our brains are most plastic when we are young children, and in fact, children who have entire hemisphere removed still can lead normal lives. Splitting the brain, a procedure in which 2 hemispheres of the brain is isolated by cutting connecting fibers, mainly those of the corpus callosum, between them. A split brain is one whose corpus callosum, the wide band of axon fibers that connects the 2 brain hemispheres, has been severed. Experiments on split brain patients have refined our knowledge of each hemisphere's special function. In the laboratory, investigators asked split brain patients to look at a designated spot and then send information to either the left or the right hemisphere by flashing it to the right or left visual field. Quizzing each hemisphere separately, the researchers have confirmed that for most people, the left hemisphere is the more verbal and the right hemisphere excels in visual perception and recognition of emotion. Studies of people with intact brains have confirmed that the right and left hemispheres each make unique contributions to the integrated functions of the brain. On occasion, hemispheric specialization called lateralization has been shown to occur. So with the corpus callosum severed, objects like the apple presented in the right visual field can be named. Objects in the pencil in the left visual field cannot, because the divided consciousness. They look at the dot, the 2 words are separated by the dot, they're momentarily projected. What word did you see? Art. Point with your left hand to the word you saw, he. So the visual side of the brain is seeing HE, but the auditory side of the brain is aware of ART. So try it. Try drawing one shape with your left hand and one with your right hand. Researchers have generally agreed that, with few exceptions, language requires the brain's left hemisphere. This seems to be true even for the majority of left-handed people. Despite the muscular activity of writing with the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. Relatively recently, Michael Gazzaniga has reported the case of Vijay, a left-handed and divided brain woman whose case challenges notions of where the capacity for language resides. When a word is presented to her left visual field, thus processed by the right half of her brain, she can write it but not say it. When the word is presented to her right visual field, thus processed by the left hemisphere, she can say it but not write it. This is the first clear scientific evidence that in some people the capacities for spoken and written language may be located in different hemispheres. The majority of scientists have argued that reading and writing are laid on top of the speech in the left hemisphere, with which the verbal skills are tightly interconnected. This new finding suggests, according to Gazzaniga, that these capacities may hop around in the brain even to the opposite side. Linguist Steven Pinker thinks that VJ's case provides evidence that reading and writing rose separately from spoken language and may be wired into the brain wherever there are spare areas. In VJ's case, the hookups for writing were made in the right hemisphere. The majority of left-handed people process language in the left hemisphere. The other lefties fall into two groups. Some have language abilities in the right hemisphere. The second group shows a puzzling mixed pattern, perhaps the same as VJ's. But nobody has tracked these exceptions carefully enough to know where exactly their language abilities lie. Further studies will determine whether VJ is in fact unique or evidence of a larger phenomenon. People with intact brains also show left hemispheric difference in mental abilities. A number of brain scan studies show normal individuals engage their right brain when completing perceptual tasks and their left brain when carrying out linguistic tasks. Is handedness inherited? Yes, archival and historic studies, as well as modern medical studies, show that right hand is preferred. This suggests genes and or prenatal factors influence handedness. About 10% of us are left-handed. Almost all right-handers process speech primarily in the left hemisphere. Left-handers are more diverse. More than half process speech in the left hemisphere, about a quarter in the right, and the last quarter use both hemispheres equally. The findings that the percentage of left-handers declines dramatically with age led researchers to examine lefty health risks. Left-handers are more likely to have experienced birth stress, such as prematurity or need for assisted respiration. They also endure more headaches. They have more accidents. They use more tobacco and alcohol and suffer more immune system problems. However, researchers continue to debate whether left-handers have lower life expectancy. Being left-handed is difficult in a right-handed world because many of the machines are designed to be used with the right hand and therefore can be dangerous for left-handers to use. The percentage of left-handed individuals decreases sharply in samples of older people. So this completes our discussion of Chapter 2.